like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us. We have a few other FP webinars available on our site right now. They cover private versus public cloud, hybrid cloud, and disaster recovery, so be sure to check those out to sharpen your understanding on any of those issues. These webinars pack a lot of information into a little bit of time, basically about the time it takes to cook a frozen pizza, which is how I can tell time. And each topic is given a high-level overview by our experts, and then we open it up to you for those questions and tweets I was talking about earlier. So let's go ahead and meet our presenters right now. We've got Mr. Chris Schwab and Mr. Joe Beyer. Gentlemen?
Thanks, Peter. So just a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. We are going to go through how to control your data in the cloud. We're going to kind of take a little bit of a life cycle approach here. So we're going to sort of start with your kind of your pre-planning, right? So going over some legal stuff, terms, contracts, things like that. Then we're going to kind of move into the scope and the implementation part of this. So that's where we're going to kind of start talking a little bit more specifically about SharePoint. We're going to talk just a little bit about what are some things we can kind of put in place when we're implementing this to control that data. And then we'll sort of move on to, once that's been implemented, what does the live environment look like and how do we sort of control that data? We are going to stay pretty high level, kind of like Peter said at the beginning. There's a lot of information here, so if we dove into it too deep, it would take too long. So we're going to kind of give you a high-level overview so that any of this stuff that you find interesting, there's a lot of information already out there. There's some more information on our site and other sites that you can kind of dive in. So if you hear something that really pertains to you, just kind of write that down and circle back and research that a little bit more. Before we get too far here, let me introduce myself. I am Chris Schwab. I'm the president of Fpweb.net. I've started here as a technical support person. I've done a lot of pre-sales, so I've talked to a lot of people basically at conferences and on sales calls, and most of the stuff in this presentation is a result of questions that have been asked of me when people are looking at these environments. So my partner today is Mr. Joe Beyer. Joe?
Thanks, Chris. As mentioned, my name is Joe Beyer. I am the Senior SharePoint Administrator here at Fpweb. I've been in the IT industry for about 12 years now and been here at Fpweb for just a little over 2.5 years. I do a lot of the builds and migrations for both new and existing customers. I'm a point of escalation for our support team, and I manage the build process from start to finish. And that is it for me.
Thanks, Joe. We're going to pull Joe in just a little bit more once we start to talk about some of the more SharePoint-specific stuff. But before we get to that, let's kind of talk about the first thing that we should be looking at when we're out there kind of assessing providers and trying to figure out what's right for us, and that is the legal matters, right? So these contracts and these terms. One thing before we go into some of the specifics to kind of be aware of is that most dedicated providers are going to be able to allow you to do something that's called a red line, which is, add some slight modifications to that contract so that it's the language that you want it to be. They may or may not accept some of those changes. It's kind of a negotiation process, but that should kind of paint a picture as far as what they're willing to do to kind of set up a custom environment for you. The more multi-tenant environments probably aren't going to do that. It just affects their terms of service a little bit too much. So just be aware that you can change some of this. You can add some of this stuff in your contract if there's something specific that we're talking about that you really want in there. The first one that seems to come up a lot is the ownership of your data, right? So you're taking this data out of your systems and you're placing it in the hands of some sort of provider, and who really retains ownership of that is in question. And most services now are going to have some sort of clause in there that says you retain ownership of that data. This really kind of came to light back in the beginning stages of Google Apps, right, where everybody was scared that they were basically giving their ownership away to Google when they would upload their documents. And in the contract, you can read that it's really not so, but there is some kind of further ambiguous nature to those contracts as far as what they can and can't do with that data. So you still own it, but what can they still kind of extrapolate and use that data for? That's where you're going to have to start getting into some more specifics if there's certain things that you don't want that provider to be able to do with your data, because you are entrusting them to take care of that, right? So they're in there doing things, like backups. They might have some sort of disaster recovery, so they have to have some sort of control of that data. But for the most part, there should be some sort of clause in there that you have ownership, kind of ultimate ownership of that data. So look for that. There's plenty of articles out there. There's plenty of stuff to research as far as what that should look like. The other thing that you need to be aware of too when you're looking through these terms is where does that data actually reside, right? So that data location part. A lot of times if you're in a dedicated service, you're going to know where that data has at least been implemented, but what are kind of your rights if the provider needs to move that around? Maybe they've changed data centers, or maybe it's even a multi-tenant service that's going to kind of float your data around. It's not tied to one data center. What are your rights as far as where that data goes? That's something to look for inside of that. Is there some sort of a notification process? Are you limited to a region? Are you limited to a country, right? So now we're kind of talking about even Patriot Act kind of stuff. So you've got, maybe you're hosting out of another country and your provider is in the United States, or maybe they have data centers in the United States. What's your control to prevent that data from kind of floating in and out of different countries? Because you probably have some regulatory stuff going on that might prevent you from doing that. And as that data moves around, another thing to kind of look for is what happens to the residual data that was there in the first place, right? So what about the data destruction? Let's say they move that to another data center. What happens to the data that was originally there? So do they delete that? Do they just let it get overwritten with other data? Is there some sort of procedure to kind of clean that up? That's something else that you can specifically look in those terms and kind of see what they're willing to do. And if it's something that is really important to you and it's not in there, ask that there be something added in there for your data that we can, that whoever's providing that service can kind of add something that's a little bit custom based upon your data. So, with the data destruction, you also got to make sure that, if you're in some sort of a disaster recovery plan too, that data gets cleaned up, right? So you've got backups, you've got disaster recovery, you've got these data locations changing, and all of that is leaving kind of these footprints of data everywhere, and we want to make sure that gets cleaned up, especially if we're dealing with some sort of sensitive data. So once we're through these terms and conditions, now it's time to kind of figure out what we're actually going to implement here, right? So we found a provider. We're pretty happy with what they've got to offer. Maybe we've negotiated a few things. We've got this set up the way that we want it to. We're ready to implement some sort of SharePoint environment. What do we do to protect that data that we can lay in there in this implementation? So the first thing that I always talk to people about is that they retain a copy of their data. So a lot of times we're coming from an environment that has some sort of existing infrastructure. It's a very low-cost way to make sure that we have a copy of this. Just take a copy of your data and locate it on your own infrastructure. So I'm going to bring Joe in here for just a minute. Joe's done a lot of migrations. He's moved a lot of SharePoint environments around. Joe, what's kind of the minimal footprint that you need to be able to get one of these environments back up and running?
Yeah, so when we're talking about a SharePoint site, we're mainly talking about the content, which basically is just a lot of documents and documents and lists and libraries, things along those lines. And basically all that is stored in content databases. And if it's a relatively small site, it's probably just one content database, but there can be large sites out there that use, 10 to 15 content databases. And, these can be pulled down. If it's a small site, you can use FTP tools. A lot of hosting providers, if it's a large site, over, 15 gigs, they can load that data onto a hard drive and ship it to you if need be.
So we're really just taking some SQL backups, we're taking those databases, and we're keeping those somewhere that we can get access to them. And pretty much anybody that knows what they're doing should be able to take those databases and be able to get your content back out of that.
Yep.
If you ideally had both environments up and running, Joe, what else would you kind of get out there and pull from those environments?
Yeah, so if you had a dedicated environment, a lot of things that would be useful is SSL certificate. That can be pretty important for a lot of customers. IIS directory files. If you have a lot of solutions installed, you're going to want those WSP files. and also the configuration database if at all possible. All those WSP solution files are stored in that configuration database, so that would also be nice.
So we have all that. We should be able to reconstruct this thing, even if we don't have something kind of just sitting there ready to go. One other thing that comes up is, some of these providers aren't necessarily dedicated, right? So it's not like I can get my hands in there and actually do a SQL backup and copy those files down. What if it's kind of more of a multi-tenant scenario where all I've really got access to is the front end?
Yeah, a multi-tenant scenario, not to get too technical, but there are some command line you can run to programmatically back up that data and get that onto an FTP side or hard drive.
And what about if we can't even get to a command line? Is there anything that we can pull data from, like through that front end?
Yeah, there's a couple of third-party tools out there. Some of them, just to mention, MetaViz, ShareGate, and MetaLogix, and you can connect directly to the site with these. And it's basically like using Windows Explorer. You can copy and paste files to and from locations. And also, SharePoint has a feature called Explore View, and that's essentially the same thing. You're going to connect to a document lister library, and you can copy and paste files that way as well.
So we basically got a copy of our raw data, I guess you'd say. We're going to miss out on some of the more SharePoint-specific stuff, the look and feel, workflows. But if we're talking about just kind of retaining and having our hands on something, at least we've got kind of the meat of what's going on here, right?
Right.
So we've got all this data. Maybe we have these SharePoint databases. Maybe we just have the front end. Where do you locate that? Is that something that you do pull home? Do you actually have some sort of a space at your existing premises, or do you actually want to maybe spin up some other kind of service? The point here is that we want to get it some way disconnected from the main production data. So maybe the provider has a secondary location. That's fine. Maybe you want to go with a secondary kind of a lightweight provider. Maybe just go and get some some space out there on any one of these cloud drives. Or maybe we pull that data home. The problem with what we're talking about here is, if something does happen, at least I can access that data, but I can't really get that back up and running very quickly. So we do have some other webinars out there that can kind of talk a little bit more in depth. We have a disaster recovery or DR webinar out there that we sort of talk about how to lay these things out so that we can have an environment actually spin up. We do have a hybrid webinar out there that talks about kind of utilizing multiple providers to sort of shape this environment and put something together that way. So that might be some further reading that we can send out, Peter, and it's or you can look it up on the site and have access to that too. So so once we have this environment spun up, we've now got some kind of safety nets in place for this data to make sure that I can always get access to it. I can always control what's kind of going on there. Now it's time to turn this environment over to our users, and I'm sure we've spent plenty of time training them and educating them and making sure they know what they're doing. But it's kind of us as administrators to make sure that we know how to recover from some of this. So once we've turned this over to our users, Joe, what are some of the ways that we can kind of protect ourselves from them doing something with that data that we didn't intend for them to do?
Right, so just to expand on that a little bit, not only do you need to protect your data from the hosting provider, you need to protect it from your actual users as well. And when you're storing documents out there, it's pretty hard to control what users make what changes and things along those lines. SharePoint has a few tools out there. One of them is versioning. And with versioning enabled, each time a file is saved, it creates a new version of that file. So if you upload the original document, each change that a user makes, it will create a separate document for that. So if the user gets in there and makes 5 changes to a document, there's going to be 5 different versions of that file, and you can keep 5 versions. It's fully customizable. If there's 150 changes made, that could be 150 different documents. Another feature is check in and check out, and what this means is if a user needs to make a change to a file, they're going to have to check that file out. That means it locks the file, so no other users can access it. When the user is done accessing the file, they need to check it back in, and that will allow it to be unlocked and then accessed by other users. Third tool is called co-authoring, and what this means is the same file can be modified by 2 different users at the same time. So if you have an Excel file up and you're modifying it, if user number 2 were to modify that same file, you would see those changes immediately appear on your screen as well.
So we've got some controls in place to make sure that our users are handling this data properly. We've got a couple other things that we can use as some safety nets too, right? We've got a recycle bin, and a lot of providers out there, if they're familiar with the product, can also do item level backups, things like that, to where we can actually pull individual pieces from this and restore those back in. If the provider doesn't offer that, there's a lot of third parties out there that also do. So there's plenty of ways that we can go in and retain copies of this once we're sort of inside that system. So just to kind of back up here, there's a lot of different stuff that we've talked about. We talked about some legal stuff. We haven't gotten into any of this too deep. Any of this that sort of pertains to you need to continue to research and to continue to investigate. There's probably some other stuff that's going on that you need to investigate internally too. Like, what are your internal needs? Do you have some sort of compliancy need that you have? Do you have any kind of intellectual property that you're trying to protect and make sure that it gets managed a certain way? Are there certain encryption needs? All that stuff is kind of an internal assessment that you need to do as well. The most important piece of advice I think I can give is just talk to your provider. Ask the provider what you're concerned about, because it's not the first time they've heard this, right? It's not the first time they've encountered these issues. So ask questions and explore this on your own. And I guess speaking of questions, Peter, we've got a few here, I think, from our listeners, right?
Well, yeah, we can open it up now for your questions. And I don't have any tweets or anything like that. Remember, guys, this is the time you can use. We can focus on a specific business need of yours, or just explore some of the pieces that Chris and Joe were talking about a bit more closely if you like. So be sure to get those questions in now. I do have a couple here, starting with, what third-party apps can be used to get a copy of your data?
So, Joe, you kind of talked about that, I think, back here in our last section. You want to go into a little bit more in depth on those?
Yeah, like I said, there's these third-party tools, and the ones we mentioned were MetaViz, ShareGate, and Metalogix. And these are all fairly user-friendly. They're easy to work with. All you need is site collection administrator rights, and you can connect directly to the site. And it looks a lot like Windows Explorer, so you can see the files. You can copy and paste those to and from your workstation. And a couple of those tools, actually, you can connect directly to content databases and extract data that way.
Okay, Philip's asking, if you keep 3 versions of a file, do you triple the storage space required?
Yes. So, yeah, there's 3 versions. It's going to be 3 separate files, essentially.
Okay. Kind of a broad question. I'm not sure exactly what they're asking, but what's the recommended way to distribute your data?
That's a little bit ambiguous. I guess we can kind of take it. We talked a lot about kind of the disaster recovery side of this. Joe, you want to kind of take a spin at that? Yeah,
so if any of you sat in on our DR webinar last month, we talked a lot about Windows 2012, Hyper-V replica. That basically means your data exists in multiple locations. So if you make a change on your live server, it'll replicate to the standby server every 5 minutes. So at any given time, you can only lose up to 5 minutes of data.
What else you got, Peter?
Okay, this is from a client. They're working on a continuity plan. Who do I talk to gather information for that plan?
You probably just want to talk to kind of any relationship manager, or whoever's handling your existing account. Pretty much any contact, whether it's us or whether it's another provider, are going to be able to take that and at least point you in the right direction. It's not something that anybody, again, hasn't ever dealt with before. So.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I would agree that just reaching out to your relationship manager should get that sorted for you. Third question that I have in front of me here: how can you truly keep control of your data in regards to the Patriot Act?
Yeah, that's probably a webinar series in itself. Anytime you're outside of the United States, the Patriot Act basically means that the government can kind of come in and view data if they have certain justifications, things like that. I don't pretend to be an expert at it. I think the important part to know is that if you're located in a country other than the United States, as a result of the Patriot Act, they've probably enacted some kind of rules of data protection of their own, and they're all different. They all have different specifications. Maybe it's some kind of data, maybe it's all data. There's a lot of different things that you have to take into account. So you're going to have to learn about what your country's kind of response to this is, and what their data protection is, and go from there. We do have a blog out there that might get you started. There's plenty of information out there. I think the other important thing I would throw out there is there's probably not one person that's an expert on the whole deal because there is so many different rules for the different countries. So you want to get your data from several different sources and kind of come to your own conclusions of what you need to do to protect that. So.
Okay, yeah, no, I agree. There are some people that follow it really closely. I know a UK journalist, Zach Whitaker, has written a lot on the subject as well. A lot of what I've written on the blog is inspired by that research. But just looking now, I don't see any other questions. If you have any last-minute questions, please try and get those in right now. I see Peter had mentioned, Peter Berkowitz had said that he thinks the audio had cut out on his dial-in line. We are going to make these videos available to everyone after we complete this, and they'll also be living online where you can also find the rest of our Fpwebinars. So yeah, be sure to use that resource. Also, if you have someone that you know this webinar can help, please feel free to share that with them. And you know, as I said, when this becomes available, we're going to send it out to everyone. So I'm not seeing any other questions coming in, so we'll go ahead and conclude right there. I just want to say thanks again, gentlemen, for preparing this for us.
Sure.
And as far as everyone that joined us and attended and is watching online, we do appreciate you as well. So thanks, and let us know what else you'd like to hear about. Until the next Fpwebinar, have a great day.